I'm Rafael.
I'm Kirk, and this is the housing problem.
If you're new to the housing problem, welcome. And please be sure to catch up on the first two seasons at thehousingproblem.com because we've spoken with so many great guests, including congressmen, commissioners, community leaders, developers, and advocates from across New York City about the challenges that make up the housing crisis and potential solutions to these problems. But if you're joining us for the first time, I think today's episode is a great place to dive in to the podcast and understand the issues facing New York City.
I totally agree. Rafael and I usually talk amongst ourselves for a bit, and I'm excited to get right to our guests so we can start the conversation, because when we were prepping for today's episode, the question wasn't what can we talk about, but how are we going to fit it all into one discussion?
Yeah, that's so true. And today we're talking to someone who grew up in New York City, who's been engaged in addressing the housing problem through the public sector for nearly 20 years. I'm Rafael Sestero. I'm the CEO of the Community Preservation Corporation. I've been involved in affordable housing for over 30 years in New York City, including time as the commissioner of New York City's Department of Housing, Preservation, and Development.
And I'm Kirk Goodrich. I'm president of Monadnock Development and been involved in affordable housing for 30 years and just really passionate about the field.
And together we have over 60 years of experience in housing in New York City. So let's cut right to the chase and introduce today's guest. Does that work for you, Kirk?
Absolutely. Our guest today grew up in Manhattan on the Lower East Side in StuyTown, or Stuyvesant Town for our listener outside New York. And we're going to talk more about StuyTown because it factors prominently into the history of the housing problem in New York City. After earning his law degree at UPenn and spending time as a litigator where he worked on important social issues, including public school funding and marriage equality, he was elected in 2005 to the New York City Council, where he served 3 terms representing a large swath of Manhattan that included StuyTown, Midtown, Times Square, and Murray Hill. During his time in office, he was a champion for his childhood home and led the effort that resulted in the largest housing preservation deal in New York City history, which he wrote about in his book, Saving Stuyvesant Town: How One Community Defeated the Worst Real Estate Deal in History.
Remarkably, after 3 terms in the city council, he wasn't turned off to public service because in 2022, Mayor Eric Adams appointed him the director of the Department of City Planning and chair of the City Planning Commission. In that role, he has been on the front lines of New York City's City of Yes initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, City Planning Commissioner Dan Garodnick. Mr. Chair, welcome to the show.
Dan, thanks so much for being on The Housing Problem. The first question we ask every guest is about their personal story and how that inspired them or led them to get involved in housing. I think for those of us who know you and know of you, you are sort of synonymous in a way with Stuyvesant Town, where you grew up. But for our listeners who don't know your story, talk about your experience growing up there and how that led you to where you are right now.
Great. Well, thanks again for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And yes, there's no question that my time growing up in Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village was pretty instrumental to the way that, certainly the way my family was able to stick around and live in New York City, but also to the way that I view community and the way that I view safety, security, opportunities to preserve affordable housing in New York City, bad planning decisions that were made over time. It's all wrapped into one. But I will say that I spent the first 4 years of my life in StuyTown. That my parents decided that they were going to make the big move uptown across 20th Street to Peter Cooper Village. So literally, I remember wheeling my fish tank across the street into our brand new Peter Cooper Village apartment. Brand new to us. It had been there for 30 years, and the reason they made that move was it was a little bigger, a little quieter, and also in those days, Peter Cooper had air conditioning and StuyTown did not. And I lived there in a rent stabilized apartment. That's where I grew up. I lived there until I went away to college. Interesting. Like a lot of people who grew up in StuyTown, as I did in Peter Cooper, sort of unaware of the complexity and challenges of that community at its birth. To us, it was just, it's where you grew up. It's
Right.
you don't think about, the fact that, thousands of people were displaced, to make room for those buildings, or that, it had a horrible whites only policy as dictated by MetLife and ratified by the city when it was first created. But to me, it was home. It was where I grew up, and
Right.
and luckily for me, I had that opportunity to be there as a place where we lived in rent stabilized housing. The ability for our small family, we're just three, mom, dad, and me, to be able to live in New York City with stability and an understanding of what the obligations were going to be on us for 1 month to the next. It allowed for us to stay in New York and for them to raise me right there on the east side of Manhattan.
So Dan, talk a little bit. You and I spent, a fair amount of time discussing the future of the Stuyvesant Town Peter Cooper Village, complexes over the years in my time in city government, and as it went through ownership transitions, et cetera. And I just remember being really inspired by the way you talked about it as a place where hardworking families could find a place that was affordable to live and raise a family like your family did. And I think that whole story inspired you to write a book about it, and write a book about what happened and sort of the fight to ensure that Stuyvesant Town remained that kind of housing. Can you just talk a little bit about, from your perspective, having grown up there and having now been, in public life in New York for so long, and now being the chair of the City Planning Commission, the place that Stuyvesant Town Peter Cooper Village has in sort of New York City's housing history, its affordable housing, issues and challenges, and sort of where it sits today in that neighborhood and in the larger community in New York.
Well, it's so interesting. Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village, since its inception, has been central to the public life and discourse of New York City and New York State.
Right.
Right from the start, the moment that contract was approved by New York City in the Board of Estimate in those days and the City Council, right up until the sale by MetLife in 2006 at the peak of the market, to the default and the ultimate deal, which was the largest preservation deal of affordable housing in New York City's history. It has always been central to the life of New Yorkers. Right when it was approved, I was noting this at the top. It was MetLife had insisted that this was going to be a whites only complex,
Right.
And it became the source of a huge organizing effort on behalf of tenants, people who lived there, who were trying to integrate the community. It became a cause citywide as a way to force MetLife to retreat on this policy, which of course had been blessed by the city. It actually gave birth to one of the very first anti-discrimination bills related to housing in the country in New York City, even before federal civil rights acts for housing existed. It used to be commonplace that,
Sure.
People would say, it's my housing. I rent to who I want. Of course, that was the case in New York City. MetLife took that position back in those days. Anyway, so, that was point one. Then through the 80s and 90s, as, residents there were suffering through increases through rent guidelines board increases and through MCI increases that they thought were exorbitant, unreasonable, was a place where people focused and organized and was a sort of a leader. That the tenants group in that community was always a leader in the efforts to push back against whatever it was that was happening. And then, of course, MetLife, 2006 at the peak, they just marketed this as the opportunity, even though it had been middle-class housing, stable, guaranteed return for them.
Right.
They got a 6% return on their investment as defined by state law. They were able to raise the rent only by what was allowed by the city of New York. Despite that forever connection to New York City and New York State, once those official limitations were lifted. MetLife decided to sell the property at the peak of the market, and they made a fortune and sold it to Tishman Speyer, which ultimately had decided that the way for them to really recoup their significant investment was to find ways to turn rent stabilized units over to market rate units as quickly as they possibly could. It did not work ultimately. And now, we, through, the efforts that we had together, Rafael, and also through your successors in the role at HPD and the deputy mayor, we were able to navigate what was a terrible, terrible situation. MetLife sale, Tishman Speyer's default, years of a special servicer relationship, and lots of uncertainty, to a more stable future where now we have a regulatory agreement in place with the city where 50% of the units need to be preserved as income restricted for the next generation. But it was years of tumult, years of complexity, and certainly opened my eyes to, what can happen in New York City if once the rules expire, what sort of things can be present. So you want to make sure you have good rules in place, good tenant protections. And that certainly was an education for me.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Dan, one of the things that we talk about a lot on the podcast and obviously in our respective policy conversations offline is how dramatically neighborhoods have changed in New York City through the years and issues many neighborhoods face with respect to gentrification. And as we were talking, we both have some exposure to the Lower East Side. You clearly more than myself and Rafael and most, having grown up in StuyTown and Peter Cooper Village. And our observation is there are few neighborhoods that have changed as dramatically as the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and which for decades and was the port of entry of sorts for many immigrant communities and the place where people would find a low-cost place to live. Could you talk about the changes you've seen there through the decades and whether those are good or bad? I mean, give me your interpretation of what's happened on the Lower East Side over the last several decades.
Yeah, well, it's a mix, right? On as it always is. I remember when I was in college, I had a favorite bar down on 7th Street and Avenue B. And I remember walking back home to where I lived on 20th Street and 1st Avenue. And I remember counting the number of times that I was offered smoke or Coke on my way home.
Right.
I just remember it was like every, like 2 times a block.
Right.
And I remember, it was just, as a science experiment, I just remember counting. I think it was like 12 times on my way home. And, the city was a very different place, and it was a less safe place, and it was certainly a less orderly place. And that had its benefits to many. And certainly that is an exciting part always that you never want to lose in New York City. On the other hand, it also was, it was objectively unsafe, and we have seen communities change for the better over time. But the big question that you're asking really is one about gentrification pressure and one about what happens to neighborhoods over time. And I think it really is central to a lot of the work that we're talking about right now in the mayor's proposal for housing, which is we've seen so much gentrification pressure in a narrow number of areas. And the reason for that is because we have lots of areas of the city that are simply not producing housing at all or functionally at all. And so, we do really want to reduce those sorts of pressures so that neighborhoods are not feeling it quite so acutely. And so with everything, it's a balance, it's a mix, but you definitely see a change. There's fewer offers of that I was getting in college than I would see today walking from 7th and B up to 20th and 1st.
So we do definitely want to jump in shortly to all of the great things that you're doing currently in the administration, but I want to just ease into it quickly with two other things. One is I want to stay on this point for a second because when I first started in this in this work in New York City in 1989, some of the very first buildings and developments that I worked on were vacant buildings that the city had taken for tax foreclosure in rem, and that were being run through one of the renovation programs in the Koch administration's housing plan. And those buildings, and I happened to be on Rivington Street the other day, and I walked right by one of those buildings, and it is still, it's still an occupied building. It's occupied, with a regulatory agreement. And so I think about, sometimes I go back and forth and I think about all of that work that we did over those years to restore vacant buildings and put regulatory agreements in place and keep them as affordable housing and repopulate many streets and many neighborhoods. And did that or did that not add to the gentrification pressures, over time? And what did that really, what would have happened had we not done that? And what else could we have done? And I think that your story about StuyTown, Peter Cooper Village relates directly to that, right? Getting it into a regulatory structure, I think helps ensure long-term, but it doesn't change the pressure, right? That exists in the city because we're so short supplied and because people just they're building anywhere they can, when they can. And we want that on one hand, but we also don't want the pressure, the gentrification pressure, right? It's sort of it's a dynamic that I'm not sure how we completely get around.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. And absent opportunities and absent ways to take a little bit of air out of the balloon of gentrification pressure, you continue to see that, and it exists in specific neighborhoods around the city. They feel it every day. That's the places where there is a market and where there's an opportunity to do it. And if that's the only place, it's going to continue unabated, and right. And that's not the way we should be planning in New York City. Now, not to take anything away from those important in-rem populate buildings with regulatory agreement processes, those were really important. They were important because they created stable, income-restricted housing for future New Yorkers. They were important because they gave stability to the community, which needed it at the time, and also made sure that there was a dynamic connection between the people who lived there and the people who had businesses in that area, which wanted them to populate them. So really important, and also, not without the dynamic of change and what we want to embrace change. Change is okay. It's just that we don't want it to be forced pressure of change because there is absolutely no alternative. And that's what we're really trying to lighten up the pressure on right now.
That's great.
So Dan, you had a really distinguished 12-year career as a city council member, and for our listener, doing housing of scale in New York is really important to reaching our production goals and relieving some of the supply pressure we see, and to address shortage. The challenge is to do projects of scale, or to make really significant change of the type that is that the mayor and you, Dan, are seeking to make with your City of Yes initiative. It requires, city council approval of those kinds of discretionary actions and rezonings. And there's a tradition in the city council that really focuses on member deference. And so to the extent that a project's in a particular council manic district, a lot of focus and attention is on how the local council member feels about the project and what their opinion is. And of course, the challenge is it's possible that a council member may not embrace a project, but it may be important for the greater good of the city. And so we really wanted you to take us behind the curtain, because I think by reputation, when you served in the council, you were a thought leader and somebody who was able to always see the big picture. Just had a level of pragmatism that people don't normally associate with some of our electeds in 2023. So could you talk about how you dealt with that circumstance where there was something clearly really important and compelling for the city council to embrace or approve, but there was some reluctance or hesitation by the local council member to embrace a rezoning or discretionary action?
Well, first of all, thank you for the kind words. I appreciate it. And I will just a viewer and listener warning: does everybody really want to go behind the curtain? If you do, I'll take you there. But it's okay.
It really is.
On second thought.
Yeah. So the first piece that I would say is the existence of member deference is not itself an altogether evil or inappropriate concept. When you're dealing with a truly local land use matter in a community, you want to have that level of local insight from the person who is the duly elected member of that district.
100%. Yep.
But what member deference it's not an absolute veto. And it shouldn't be treated as an absolute veto. It's deference. It's like, you have the microphone, you have the attention. We should give some level of deference to you because you presumably have more insight on this than the rest of us, wherever it is. But it's not absolute, and it's not without limits. And I think that is truly how it has been treated over time. And I also will share with you my own experience. I can give you an example of a member who did stop a project, which happened to be me, as it related to the East Midtown rezoning.
Right.
Where there was a big neighborhood plan, 80 blocks in Midtown, that Mayor Bloomberg had proposed at the very, very end of his administration, which I thought was very much on the right track, but I actually didn't think that I didn't think we had the ability to actually lock in the public benefits sufficiently before the clock was going to run out. We didn't have enough time to do like a serious stakeholder engagement on it. And also the way it was initially crafted, it had a 5-year sunrise provision. So nothing was going to actually happen for 5 years anyway. So I said, you know what, I wanted to encourage my colleagues and the speaker to say, let's stop and hold for a moment in proceeding here. Now, should the local council member of East Midtown have the level of deference? No, you should not. And I really didn't, because it was something where I worked with my colleagues, with the speaker, to understand this was not just me saying no. It was me saying yes, but I also need to pick this up in the next administration because we don't have the ability to get it done here in the way that I think it needs to be done. That I think is that's the flavor of how it should work. It just can't be a flat no without any answer to how to solve the problem. It has to be let me articulate to you what's wrong and how I can fix it, because a straight no on, economic development, a straight no on housing opportunities is not going to work for New York City at this moment in our history. So I think that, behind the curtain, what you really do see is that deference. It's a respect that's offered to the local member. It's not absolute. You still have to make your case to your colleagues. You still have to make that case to the speaker. And that's how it ultimately should work out. When we are proposing citywide initiatives, we are making the case to the entire council. Right. We are saying, we know that housing is an important priority for you as an institution. We know it's important to you as the speaker. We know it's important to you as individual members. You have made it abundantly clear that you want to move the needle significantly on this conversation. In some ways, it takes the member deference piece out of the equation somewhat, because we're dealing with it globally. But we know that we still need to make the case member by member as to why this is important, why the moment is now, why it matters to people's constituents, what are the human costs of not having enough housing supply. And it's one of the reasons why we feel very optimistic about the moment that we are in to be able to do something bold here, because people are beginning to really recognize those human costs for not having enough housing supply in New York City.
So that's a great setup, Dan, because I think you are and have been since you joined the Adams administration as chair of the City Planning Commission, embarking on some of the most meaningful citywide proposed reforms in the city's history. I mean, honestly, in my time in city government, we focused our time and energy mostly on rezonings in specific local neighborhoods that we worked very hard to get done to create more land and more availability for building housing. The de Blasio administration did do some citywide reforms. They were really important things, mandatory inclusionary, obviously among them, very important. And I've always viewed these kinds of changes in policy as being evolutionary as opposed to revolutionary. Although when reviewing the list of things that are currently on the proposed docket for your City of Yes plan, you're touching the edge of revolutionary there, my friend, as opposed to evolutionary. And so I want to give you a couple of minutes to talk about City of Yes is a terrific soundbite, right? I mean, of course we want to be a City of Yes. Although many of us who have been toiling away for a long time in this, and particularly recently, have felt like we're more a city and state, frankly, not just city and state of no. And so talk to us a little bit about what you think, one, how you're gonna change that mentality from yes to no, and two, give us a quick overview of the substance of what's in there, and then we can talk a little bit about a couple of the most important ones.
Yep. So just to set the stage here, and I know your listeners are well familiar with the dynamic of where we are as a city, but you have more than 50% of New Yorkers are rent burdened. In some neighborhoods, that's even higher, meaning that they pay more than 30% of their income in rent. The vacancy rate for the least expensive apartments, $1,500 or less, is functionally zero. And over the last decade, we created 800,000 new jobs and only 200,000 units of housing. So people are squeezed. They're feeling the pressure here, and also that the imbalance of power between landlords and tenants is stark. In a situation where you have few options, when somebody is let's assume for the moment that you're not a rent protected tenant, when a landlord is looking to jack up your rent, or you're asking them to make a repair, or you are considering what your alternatives are, either in terms of the housing quality or neighborhood or whatever. If you don't have options, you're stuck. That is bad for you. You functionally cannot have real tenants' rights in a market that is so squeezed in favor of existing property owners. That is bad for renters. So we want to create more opportunity. We want to create a little bit more housing in every neighborhood of New York City. Why? And we believe that in the aggregate, that will create a significant amount of new housing for all New Yorkers, but it will limit those sorts of drastic neighborhood changes that people frequently fear will happen, because it's a little bit everywhere. So when you think about New York City, you think about our high density areas, the downtown, Brooklyn, Long Island City, Manhattan. You might think about our low density areas, Northern Queens, Staten Island. We have in this proposal put forth changes that we believe would be applicable in all areas. So we have high density area proposals, we have low density area proposals. And to your point, Rafael, I will take you through a few of them just by way of examples. In low density areas, we want to enable modest, what we call our missing middle housing, 3 to 5 story apartment buildings near transit. Yep. So if you are near transit on a wide street, on the short end of a block, on a big enough lot that allows you to be eligible, we think you should be able to put a modest apartment building there. It is the sort of apartment building that exists all over the city, including in our low density areas. It is exactly where we want to enable it. That's something we want to do. That's number one. Number two, and relatedly, on commercial strips that you see also all around the city, a single story of 4 or 5 commercial establishments. It could be a laundromat next to a deli, next to a doctor's office, and there's nothing at all above that. We think that you should also be able to add a modest multifamily building right there above these town centers. So town center zoning allow for modest amounts of growth right there. It supports that little group of businesses.
Right.
It creates more lively interplay between the housing and the commerce. And also it's the sort of building that exists in so many places in New York City and bothers nobody, that we think it is exactly the right thing to be enabling right there. Also in low density areas, enabling modest additions to a garage or to a cottage in the backyard. If you want to be able to convert your garage into, as long as it's less than 800 square feet, into a home for an elderly relative, sometimes people call them mother-in-law units. I don't know why, but whatever. And if you want to do that, you want to even rent it out, generate some revenue to help you pay your own mortgage, save some money for your kids' college tuition, or even for wealth creation purposes solely as a middle-class homeowner. You wanted to be able to put some money in the bank. That is okay. It is happening all around the country. Yes, New York City homeowners should be able to take advantage of this. It is modest. It works completely. We should give them that chance. So that's some of the low density stuff. Then we have proposals for our higher density areas. So for Midtown Manhattan or other what we call in zoning R6 to R10, not just Midtown, but also medium to high density areas, we want to create a preference for affordable housing. So as you gentlemen know, today we have a bonus structure for senior affordable housing. If you are prepared to give to the public the permanent affordable housing for senior citizens, if you're going to make that available, we're going to allow you roughly a 20% bonus on your development site. Great program. It works. People like it. And it applies to certain geographies around the city. We want to take those geographies and we want to make that senior affordable housing applicable to all types of affordable housing. That's number one. You get that bonus. You give us affordable. You give us supportive. You give us senior affordable. We are going to allow you to go roughly 20% bigger. And in the areas that are medium and high density areas that today that program is not applicable, we're going to make it applicable there too. Good. We think medium, high density, those are exactly the places where we want to create opportunities for affordable housing in New York City. They're close to transit. They have lots of amenities. It's consistent with our fair housing goals. We want to incentivize that there. So that's another proposal that we have for medium and high density. Commercial offices, office conversions. This one's gotten a lot of attention over the last couple of years because of, a pandemic, which has prompted some people to work from home from time to time. We've noticed we now have a 19% vacancy rate in our commercial office space, and our rules governing commercial to residential conversion, it's very strict. It's roughly speaking and there are exceptions to this, but if your building is not in Midtown Manhattan and built anytime after 1961, you're out. You can't do it. You have to be pre-1961 and in Manhattan for all intents and purposes, and then you have the ability to convert from office to residential. Outdated, doesn't work, creating unnecessary obstacles. We want to move that date to 1990, expand the geography citywide. And I'm dwelling. There's a lot to this proposal, so I'm carrying on. But I'll just give you a couple more quick examples, and then we'll stop and talk about whatever else you guys want to talk about in more detail. We want to enable smaller units and shared housing as part of this proposal. Zoning has strict limits. It should not. Campuses frequently are limited by existing zoning limitations on what you can do, even when you have development rights. That is something we want to address here. And then lastly, and this is an important one, there are so many conflicts that exist today between parking and housing. Today, the zoning resolution of New York City defines within an inch of its life the amount of parking that you need to deliver in every zone, every development, every neighborhood. And it was
almost like cars are more important than people.
It almost sounds that way. And what's interesting about that is it suggests that we know the answer to this question as to what the minimum number of parking spaces should be in every single building in the city. We do not know the answer to this question. The bureaucrats of the Department of City Planning 1961, they didn't know the answer to that question either. And what we are proposing to do here is to eliminate those mandates on what the minimum number should be. And that means that neighborhood by neighborhood, building by building, we will know the answer because people will choose to build parking where it is needed, and that is okay. But we don't want somebody to put up a building and be faced with the question of, boy, I could go and do more housing units here, but the parking requirements, they are extremely onerous, they're extremely expensive, and I'm going to make the decision to do fewer units because I have to do parking here, full stop. So we want to do away with that mandate. We know that there will be parking, and that's okay. We're not putting in mandates of a maximum, limit on what you can do, but we want to eliminate the minimum because it no longer makes sense, and we believe we're finally going to prioritize housing over parking. So that's it. I'm going to stop right there. I'm talking far too long.
I'm gonna jump in on the parking one real quick because this is one that has frankly, ever since I was in city government, because before that I wasn't really involved in some of this stuff, and so, but ever since I've been city government, I've been astonished at how people are so focused on maintaining parking requirements. But at the same time, they're reviewing and approving so many development plans for building on parking lots that were created that nobody ever uses. So I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. We're building on the parking lots that were created in the late 60s, 70s, whatever. But we're still saying you have to build all this parking that nobody is using. So I think that one is should be really simple. And you're right. The market is going to build parking where they know they need it because it's going to enhance their ability to lease, the units.
I mean, you can think about so many examples in New York City. I mean, if you're building a 1 or 2 family home in Staten Island, if you don't put parking in there, you're done. Sorry, no, you have no shot at selling that home. You have no chance at renting that apartment. You're out. And there are plenty of areas in the city where it's absolutely essential. But with the average cost of a parking space in New York City of $67,500, which, by the way, is the average. That's the average. And that includes your $5,000 blacktop outside of somebody's single family home to the $200,000 dig into the basement in a place where, it's very expensive to build. That's where it averages out. And we can't afford anymore to make building developers have to face that choice of, I've got 10 units. When I get to my 11th unit, all of a sudden I need to add 6 parking spaces. You know what? I'm good. I'm stopping at 10. No, we can't afford to do that anymore. And that's why we included this as part of it.
So Dan, that was, I think the ambition of the City of Yes proposal you just laid out is important, because that's exactly what we need, given the problem we face in terms of our housing shortage and our crisis. We need ambition. Just so our listener understands at a high level, we're talking about 100,000 homes over the next 15 years, 260,000 temporary jobs, 6,300 permanent jobs, and potentially over 58 billion of economic impact to the city over the next 30 years. So the promise of what you're describing is compelling. One of the things I want to pivot to, which is obviously the challenge, is whether you're talking about building a building or executing ambitious policy, is the rollout and marshaling the political support. And what we've seen really vividly with our efforts to house asylum seekers over the last year is that there's a tremendous amount of political and community resistance to meeting our obligations under the consent decree. And so I think what differentiates this is we're saying we agree creating temporary housing and shelters for people coming in our city is not what we need. What we need is more permanent housing. Here is a solution that theoretically people who don't like the way we creating temporary shelter should embrace. Could you talk, having served in city council and been in these sorts of conversations, could you talk a little bit about the execution and detail around the political task, neighborhood by neighborhood, among community stakeholders and elected officials? How do you see that being rolled out?
Yeah, well, it's important for us to note here that this Department of City Planning has worked extremely hard to make sure that all of our stakeholders, and particularly the ones who ultimately will be voting on this proposal, have a clear sense of what we're trying to do, the challenges of it, the details of it, the timing of it. The City Council is our partner in this. We understand that nothing comes easy, particularly the things that matter. And so we have been talking to them about this for quite some time. And that is a deliberate choice because we are in this together. This is meaningful to all residents of New York City, the constituents of any one council member, and to everyone else. We also are at the beginning of this process. So we are starting now the beginning of our environmental review on this proposal, which means that it is teed up for official consideration by community boards and borough presidents in the spring, and then would be voted on by the city council in the fall of next year. So it is, it's not tomorrow,
right?
But it's also not forever down the line either. This is a process that is upon us, and that we have also given ourselves enough time to thoughtfully engage with community boards, with borough presidents, elected officials, stakeholders, et cetera, to be able to give us another opportunity to talk to the state about ways to even further enhance all of the things that we want to do. Everything that we've proposed here, by the way, is something that we have the power to do in New York City.
Yeah.
Administration, city planning, plus city council, done. But everything that we have proposed to do here also could be made significantly better with acts from the state of New York. So it gives us enough time to have a serious conversation about this. And my hope in this process is by doing this in the way that we are doing it. It's not we're not casting a vote on this tomorrow. We're not even casting a vote on this next month. We are putting out a thoughtful proposal, giving people a chance to evaluate and debate and consider. We believe that at the end of the day, there will be a recognition of the need for us to do something significant here. And we are going to spend every free moment of the next 12 months engaging, talking to all of those folks who traditionally have seen challenges in their neighborhoods. Some of them it's because they're in a gentrifying neighborhood and they say, well, boy, I don't want to see more development here. Okay. It might feel like counterintuitive as to why you should approve a citywide proposal for housing. In fact, it is the thing which gives you relief. And you could represent, an area in a high density neighborhood where people are concerned about the affordability of housing. We're going to create that as an opportunity. Lower density areas, we want to do things thoughtfully with finesse on the margins and give homeowners a little breathing room. These are good arguments for us to be making, particularly right now. Yeah. So, Kirk, to your point, I think everything is, when you go with something big and thoughtful and that really meets the moment, it's not going to be without challenges, but we think that we have lots of winning arguments here that actually will affect people's lives for the better. We don't need to live this way. We do not need to live with housing prices the way they are in New York City today. It's a choice. We want to make different choices now, and that's what this is all about.
Yeah. So we only have a couple minutes left, but you teed up I think the last piece of this that I did want to give you just a couple of minutes to talk about, because you and the mayor in your conversations with the city council have laid out what is a remarkably ambitious set of changes that are well needed, and that, to your point, are not just about building in every neighborhood. They're about releasing pressure valves and making minor changes that will allow things to happen at a scale and in a way all around the city that we need. But as we all know, and as the listener knows from past episodes, Governor Hochul announced a really ambitious plan that framed the housing argument in a new way, which I, for one, was very excited about. This argument around how many jobs we've created versus how much housing we've created, and how we're losing people to the states around us that are building housing faster than we are. But that proposal didn't meet a lot of support, and so I know you said it a minute ago. Everything that you can do for your City of Yes proposals can be done locally, but can be made better by actions from the state. And so, wanted to hear a little bit your thoughts about the coming year, where potentially you see opportunities for the state to enhance what you're trying to do, and what you think the path forward is in terms of getting the state legislature to really embrace the kind of change that we need in order to enhance all of the work that you're trying to do.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, when we change zoning and when we look to do it in a significant and citywide way, we are making a directional change for the city that should apply for the next 60 years or more.
Right.
And we think of it in that vein, which is, where and how do we want to thoughtfully do these things and recognize that we will have interest rates environments that are going to change many dozen times between now and then. We will have tax incentive programs at the state level that will probably come and go many times between now and then. But we do know that this is directionally where we should head. Now, in terms of the stuff that the state can do. So tax policy is an important piece of the puzzle for housing creation, as you all know. And we would like to see the state re-up some form of 421A that would allow for the incentive to do a lot of the things that we are enabling here. We also would like the state to lift the cap on residential density. Right now, as you know, there's a 12 FAR cap. It's arbitrary. It's antiquated. It's an old way of thinking, much like a lot of the other things that we're talking about in this proposal.
Like your commercial zoning, the renovation thing, right?
Right. That's exactly right. It's just old. It's old thinking. New York City can very well handle our own decision-making as it relates to residential density. They should lift that. They should do away with that. Also, in the context of office conversion, we'd like them to incentivize the creation of affordable housing in the connection with an office to residential conversion. Today, it's a market opportunity, which of course creates housing, and we like to create housing. We also would really like to create affordable housing through this process. A state tax incentive would allow us to do that. If you're asking me to prognosticate on Albany, I'm going to decline respectfully to do that because I spend my time in New York City. I go up to Albany, we'll make our case. It's a complicated place. The governor's proposal was, you are correct, big and bold. We give her a lot of credit for that. There are people in Albany who are pushing for bold action on housing. We love and support that. And we're going to make our argument as to why the stuff the city is doing is important and should have their support as state legislators for the city's own process, even though they don't have a vote, and why the actions that they can take up in Albany would really enhance over the next period of time what we're trying to do and help alleviate some of those real burdens that New York City residents are facing today.
Hey, Dan, I want to thank you for coming on The Housing Problem, and we were really looking forward to this conversation. We felt it would be a compelling and meaty one, and it was all that we hoped for. Congratulations on your amazing journey, and thank you for your leadership and your vision in helping us to meet the kind of challenges that are ahead.
Thanks, Kirk. Thanks to both of you for having me.
100% agree with all of that. It's great to see you, and thanks for the conversation.
Good to see
really
you.
Appreciate it. All right.
Pleasure.
Thanks. Wow, Kirk, a big thank you again to Dan Garodnick, the chair of New York City Planning Commission. What a great conversation. And I've said many times, and I'll say it again, we're lucky to have folks in public office in New York like Dan. We really hope that these conversations lead to a greater understanding of the housing problem and potential solutions, and we hope you're enjoying listening to The Housing Problem. I'm Rafael Sestero.
And I'm Kirk Goodrich. You can contact us and find out more about affordable housing in New York City at thehousingproblem.com.
And please subscribe to and share The Housing Problem, because the more we explore the housing problem, the better chance we have to find the housing solution.
Produced by Paul Jamali. Executive producers Rafael Sestero, Kirk Goodrich, Eric Biederman, and Tom Corsillo. The Housing Problem podcast is a top content production from Marino PR.
Thank you. You guys want to run for the city council?
No, thanks.
No, maybe when I'm 70.
I'm not gonna dodge that like you did prognosticating on Albany. I'm just gonna come out with it. No.
And by then, Dan, it'll be more like a crawl than a walk or a run.
You guys are awesome. Thank you for that. Good to see you both.
All right.
We'll talk
Thanks,
to you very
Dan.
soon.
Take care.
See you
later.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.